a parent has a child between the ages of 0 and 5, like what are the things they can do to increase the cognitive development?
So that's a great place to start.
Can parents specifically say, like, I want my kid to have a high IQ?
Intelligence itself, it's a very hotly debated construct. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescents 10 to 14 in this country.
Really?
Yes.
I did not know that. There's been an explosion of awareness and diagnoses of ADHD.
With ADHD, it is one of the most thrown out diagnoses there is, sometimes by people who shouldn't be sort of diagnosing someone.
What can parents do to increase the probability that their kids don't end up spoiled?
This is a great question.
All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Dr. Misiaszek here with me, which I hopefully pronounced that correctly.
Did.
First place I want to start is child psychology. Everyone knows that brains don't end up getting developed for at least males 25 years old or so. And there's a 25-year period from birth to that point. How should we think about the development of the child's brain and kind of psychologically how they develop through, their infant years into childhood and then teenage years? Like, is there a good framework that parents or people could think about that development process?
That's a great question, Anthony. Child development is a time of, rapid brain development, as you mentioned. It's a long process. The prefrontal cortex part of our brain, which is the thinking, planning, organizing, multitasking, creative thinking, problem-solving part of our brain does not develop until we are about in our mid-20s. That said, though, there are specific critical periods of a child's development that if they don't have an environment that nurtures that brain development, it can be it can go haywire. So some of those critical periods are the early infancy, childhood years from 0 to 5. But let me pause here and say, so you asked about different frameworks to think about development, right? So then there's ages and stages: infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood, school age, latency age, adolescence. And then there's different ways that they can develop in different domains. So there is cognitive development, right? Their thinking capacities. There is also physical maturation. They can socio-emotional development, personality development. So what would be helpful to start with, given this so broad?
Let's start from really young ages, right? So maybe like the 0 to 5,
okay.
Kind of early birth. One of the things that I think becomes big debate is like nature versus nurture,
yes.
right?
Yes.
And as with most things in society, like the black and white is probably not the right framework.
Yes.
There's probably a lot of gray.
Yes.
But just given your experience and a lot of the research that's out there, like how do we think about if a parent has a child between the ages of 0 and 5, like what are the things they can do to increase the cognitive development or accelerate it? And then maybe what are the things to like avoid that we know for sure, like, hey, this screws up kids if they're, either exposed to certain environments or the parents are doing certain types of things.
Okay, great. So that's a great place to start. So 0 to 5. So thinking about development in that area, in terms of cognitive development, when you're, infant, 0 to 1, there's a lot of, you take in the world with a lot of your senses, so you see like sucking, there's a lot of, there's breastfeeding that goes on. There's like a lot of attachment building. And the kids, infants start to learn what's called object permanence, for example, is a hallmark between 0 to 1 that, if then an object will still exist even if it disappears, that an object is still there. So if you're dropping your child at daycare, they know that mom or dad will come back. So that's one concept that unfolds over time from 0 to 1. And then, 2 toddlerhoods, you hear about the terrible 2s, a time when their will and their control and, I want to do it my way, sort of comes online. And that is, so as a parent, to help support that, you'd want to help them, not be too over controlling, kind of course, you have to control if they're going to run out onto the street or something like that, but you want to give them choices. Think, what would you like to wear this or this today? Finding ways to build in some of their unique interests that are coming online to support that. And there was a second part of the question that you had asked.
So like, when you think of what to do, I generally look at it, most people know I've got a young 9-month-old daughter, and I already can tell a couple of things. The first is allowing for the exploration and all of this. It just, you could tell like she's figuring things out.
Yes.
And the first time she like wanted to pick something up and put it down, and like it's like cool, right?
Cause and effect.
Yeah. A friend told me, he's like, you're going to rediscover the world through the eyes of a child.
Yes.
And so I see that. But also there's probably things that parents should not do between the ages of like 0 to 5. And some of it, I categorize as like the overly ambitious parent of like, you're trying to push your kid too much to do things.
Yeah.
So like, are there things there? And then also just like things that could just be detrimental to their development as well. Like what are some of those things?
Okay, great. And I think I just recalled you mentioned the nature versus nurture debate. So I want to also make sure I answer that. And so, as you know, for nature, though we're referring to things like our genes, right? And the thought was that once those genes are there that you've inherited from your parents, that is set in stone, and that's what you're going to become and dictate who you are. And then the nurture side of things is the environment, experiences, right? And fortunately, this debate has been put to rest. We know, as you said, that things are not black and white, that it's a combination of nature versus nature and nurture. And it's a field called epigenetics, which looks at how the environment shapes which genes and when are expressed. So this can be easily as an example in the field of toxic stress, for example, or when children face prolonged periods of stress, constantly are, bombarded with domestic violence, for example, in the home, or food insecurity and things like that. And they don't have the buffer of a parent, of a caregiver to buffer that stress. That's when we know the brain architecture, the development of our brain and our neurons and the pathways can then, lead to poor outcomes.
What happens in that situation? Because I know you've done a lot of work here on children and kind of being exposed to various stressful situations and stuff, especially in development. Like, if a child is unfortunately exposed to these stresses, is it literally the chemistry in their brain is changing?
Yes, yes, the physiological profiles of chemistry in their brain. Because when you're stressed, right, you have the fight or flight or freeze coming online, and so your body is pumping cortisol, is pumping adrenaline, and those hormones makes the blood vessels send blood to your muscles, your extremities, and takes away from the brain. So your brain is not really developing and forming as it should. Kids who have been exposed to toxic stress, their amygdala is always in looking out for danger. That's the amygdala looks for threat, for fear, is the fear part of our brain. And the prefrontal cortex that we talked about earlier is not coming online, and it's not sending back messages saying, I'm safe, calm down, you can rest, you can digest, everything. So everything from physical health, diabetes, heart disease. It's like if your body was a car, it would be like it's constantly revving that car engine, and there's a lot of wear and tear and stress in the body. So not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, cognitively, all those things. That's why it's so critical for the early period.
What's fascinating is, immediately jumps to mind, I have somebody that I met, and they were explaining to me that babies could be born, obviously, to parents who are addicted to certain types of drugs. And the woman who was telling me this, her parents had actually adopted a child who was addicted to meth because the parents had been, or the mother had been on meth. And what she said to me, which was fascinating, was there are a number of examples where actually physically these children are what society would deem as like ripped, right? And their physiological structure appears to be different from a cosmetic standpoint. And it's because actually while they're in the womb, they're so stressed out 24/7 that there's almost this like a flexing that's happening. And so, again, understanding that that's not my specialty, and I'll take that at face value, that there's some directional truth to that. Is the same thing happening with the brain as well, both in the womb if the mother is stressed, and then also in the early years if the child itself is stressed?
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at things from prenatal, how the mother was during pregnancy, if she was involved in a stressful, interpersonally violent relationship, we look at that. All those things, because the fetus is developing, and all the, the heartbeat, all those things. And also when you're born, I think the research says that by age 3, 80% of the brain is already the size it's going to be as an adult. So it's a very, very critical period.
And are there things that moms can do? So if there's mothers or fathers that are listening to this that are about to have a child or they are pregnant today, are there things that the mother can do to have less stress, which then will have a positive impact on the cognitive development of the baby? Yeah. Or is it cognitive development is really only affected post-birth?
Oh, yes. Great question. I think just even from, the condition and the mental state, the emotional state of the family, of the parental relationship, the stability of that as well is something to look at. And of course, there's also intergenerational things to look at as well. But, trying to, yes, you have to keep that instrument in tune, right? And take care of yourself. So as much as you can take care of yourself, kind of stay less stressed, you'll be more be able to tune to separate sort of what is my sort of anxieties and uncertainties from my child's and not project that onto the child, for example. And I'll stop there and say maybe if there's any, like when we talk about things that parents can do, are there maybe certain distinctions that we could talk about maybe?
Well, and when my wife was pregnant, one of the things we kept hearing is like, hey, if the mom is not stressed, then the baby will be calmer. And to some degree, you're like, that sounds a little like woo-woo. Yeah. Like, sure, maybe, hindsight bias makes you feel better about it. But it does feel like if, I don't know, all of my friends who have been pregnant, some of them were really, really stressed out, not necessarily just because of the pregnancy, because of work or other situations. And some were very calm. And it does feel like the experiences were different to some degree. And I do wonder, how much of an impact on the child does it have?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're talking about the stress when I talked earlier about like the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala always firing. I think that is when it's like prolonged, unbuffered, chronic type of stress when you have those changes. But say a little bit of work stress that the mother had, but the child is born healthy and fine and there's minimal sort of, some stress is good, Children develop through these conflicts that they have to resolve at each stage. So some stress and a certain level of anxiety is good. It pushes us to get to the next developmental stage, right? So I think the distinction is when you have that prolonged, unbuffered, you don't have a stable, supportive caregiving relationship to help you process things and kind of understand the world. That's when things can go awry.
And so when we look at this like nature versus nurture, like what are the parts that genetically people agree in the scientific community, like, okay, these are the genetic things, and whether they're kind of turned on or exposed or expressed, early on versus later, like this is genetic versus like, are there specific things that are nurture specific and not necessarily relying on genes?
That's a great question. And I know researchers are studying things that at the gene level or the cellular level, for example, like telomeres, for example, in kids who have been exposed to chronic stress and trauma, those become shorter. And those then, shorter telomeres mean shorter length of life, right? And then as far as nurture, on the other side of things that, again, it's that supportive, I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's that supportive caregiver relationship with that attachment relationship with you and your child, that will help them sort of get that resiliency to bounce back from things.
One of the pieces of advice that I've heard repeated over and over again is just like the best thing you can do for your kid is love them. And it's kind of this weird thing. It's not very quantitative, right? It's not like a prescriptive, okay, I do A, B, and C every day and like we're good. Yeah. How important is that? And are there ways that maybe a kid who's, 0 to 5 years old versus like a teenager kind of feels that differently? Or is it pretty much the same thing of like literally just care and you should be okay?
Yeah, such a great question. And love is a great concept. And, there's different ways to describe love. And I, speaking here as a parent myself with 2 kids, and then also then I could speak from a psychological perspective. And, when you think of love and you're thinking about attachment, which is about, the relationship and bonds with a significant caregiver or romantic partner. And you think about attachment again, there's a study, the rhesus monkey study where they took some rhesus monkeys, infant ones that were just born, and put them with a wire monkey with a bottle. and then a wire monkey with a terry cloth, a soft kind of cuddly terry cloth. And the baby monkeys, whenever they were scared or frightened, well, first of all, they spent more significant time cuddling up with the terry cloth monkey. But even though the other one had food, so they would just get the food and then head back to the other monkey. So that attachment, that love is important. And then sort of speaking from a personal hat, a person of faith, for example, loving your kid, loving your spouse, that parental love that you model in the home, that love and self-sacrifice, that self-donative love is a good context and foundation that children can then develop socially and pro-socially in. Like we're our kids' first educators in that.
Yeah. And speaking of education, there's a million toys and software and all kinds of crazy stuff that I've seen. Some friends have, they swear by, others are ads that you see on Instagram or whatever. But they all promise something similar, which is like we can accelerate the child's cognitive development. We can keep them on track. Is this all real? Is it bullshit? Like, how should parents think about a lot of these like supplemental things?
Yeah.
And I don't know, if I asked my dad, he's like, back in the day, no one had any of this stuff, right? And like everyone turned out okay. Like how do you think about that from a psychological development standpoint?
Yeah, another great question. And again, I'm not a person that throws like the baby out with the bathwater. I like kind of moderation and balance. And I think technology can harness a lot of great learning opportunities. It can hasten learning, for example, in some ways. But those same, it can create contact with people around the world that you wouldn't have had the opportunity back in the day to have. And so I think some of those same characteristics that make technology so great can also be its downfall as well. Just the instant gratification, right? Social media, you have kids, as you said, spending more time on their tablets and their phones than being out with friends, having face-to-face conversations. But as far as the toys question, I think you had mentioned, for especially young kids, when you think about like an iPad and you think about a young 2-year-old just passively sitting there kind of watching what's being fed to them, you want to look at toys that you as a parent can have what's called this serve and return type of building that reciprocity. You have joint attention, you have the eye contact, you're saying, I see you, I see the things that, you heard the bird in the sky that just flew overhead, I see it too. You're labeling them, the things that they can see in the world. You're having them with you, narrating the things you're doing, washing the dishes. So toys, that like puzzles, building blocks, those types of things they still have a good place. And
so really it almost feels like active versus passive becomes like a big differentiator between the things that the kids do. And it sounds like maybe it's not the extremes of like it has to be 100% active or 100% passive. Instead, there may be a time and a place.
Yeah.
I think everyone's gone to a restaurant and seen the parents are like,
I need to eat.
Here's the phone. Like, I swore I wouldn't be that parent, and then like, here's the phone, kid. Right? It feels like that doesn't necessarily, destroy all of the progress that's made elsewhere. Right. But maybe the majority of time you want in more of an active
learning experience. Yeah, absolutely.
And talk a little bit about, you mentioned describing the things that you're doing or kind of labeling these pieces. Like, what is going on with the child, especially kind of 5 or under? Like, what is going on with the cognitive development as to like why it's important to almost talk to them in that way?
Yeah. So, talking with them, they don't have the language yet. So kind of hearing, modeling is from these continued structure and routine and playing with them that they end up then building up the capacity to do these things. So I was talking about the stages in the beginning, like 0 to 1, that sensory motor stage. And then the next stage would be, their minds, a child's mind is so different than an adult's mind. So, when they're like 2 to about 6, they have, for example, what's called like magical thinking. Like they think that because they wish something, it's going to happen. And they're very egocentric in their thinking. So they don't take the perspective of another person, for example. It's like why when I'm playing hide and seek with my daughter, and she thinks that just because she puts the blanket over her head, it means that I can't see her, or she hides, and she's hiding in plain sight. and she doesn't know that I can see, I can see her. So,
and that's because she can't see you.
Yes, so she thinks that I can, yeah. Or it's like if I have a boo-boo or something and she's like, oh, take this stuffy toy. It's going to make you feel better. Like the ways that would comfort her is the way that would comfort me as an adult. So they're very egocentric. I see you have a question.
Yeah. Well, and I guess part of that is there's this famous study that says lower income children will actually hear 30 million less words than their higher income peers by the time they reach kindergarten. And we don't think, if we sat here and already counted how many words we've spoken in this conversation alone, it'd be a lot more than we probably would guess. But 30 million words seems so drastic of a swing between high and low income children. It sounds like a huge piece of it is just like talking to the kid, right? And engaging with them.
Right. And then reading to them, providing, opportunities for them to I think though a lot though is that interactive piece, because you can talk around them. You could talk like they could be hearing you peripherally talking, like say we had a child here. But I think that, again, like it's that interactive piece of talking with them, talking to them, and also trying to avoid the motherese kind of babbly, like talking regular sentences as you would, so that they don't kind of end up with that baby kind of talk. You want to speak in regular words so that they can hear how the regular word would sound.
And is this like you treat the kid, maybe not like an adult, but you treat them like a human that you would have a regular conversation with, and then they will develop faster, or not so much, and maybe something else you're optimizing for?
Yeah, no, not so much. I think though, there's a place for like the big expressions and then like the eye contact. I think it's when they're starting to learn to speak at some point, you just want to make sure that you're able to say words that won't then they will learn that are the regular ways of our language, or English language. Yeah.
And then what about multiple languages, either at home or at school or whatever? I know some folks who the parents both speak English, they're native English speakers, and they have an aspiration for their kid to learn another language. So they put them into specific school settings. I know the opposite end of the spectrum, which is English as a second language in the home. And so the parents will say, hey, you'll learn English at school and you'll learn whatever the native language is here at home. How does multiple languages and the exposure to that at an early age develop the cognitive abilities of the child as they get older?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know researchers do study sort of the effects of learning two languages and when a child begins to talk, or even IQ and academic achievement. The one thing I remember taking away from some of that literature is that, those who are bilingual or trilingual or learn many different languages, they have greater cognitive flexibility. As you can imagine, they're switching between two languages in their brain, and two types of maybe cultural contexts as well. If you're from, say, where I'm from in Jamaica, for example, or in the US, there's a different sort of context as well that comes online. So there's the benefit of having cognitive flexibility when you speak multiple languages.
Yeah, and something like cognitive flexibility, like if you walked out on the street and you asked a random person, like, what is that? They'd be like, I have no clue. Right?
Yeah.
Like, sounds like a smart person thing, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like the general reaction that you'd get. How much of a parent's kind of activities can be dictated around, like, I want my kid to be high IQ, I want my kid to have cognitive flexibility, and it's like almost intentional, versus some of these things are just merely the result of a great loving environment that's stable without a lot of stress, and it's not so much prescriptive. Like, can parents specifically say, like, I want my kid to have a high IQ, and so let's do A, B, and C? Or is that wishful thinking and maybe parents are over optimizing?
So that's one thing when you mention IQ, that is something kind of determined a little bit by like endowment, kind of what you're born with, a little bit of an innate thing. Although, intelligence itself, it's a very hotly debated construct. But if you think about the definition of intelligence as the capacity to think, to reason, to solve problems, to be able to put together knowledge in novel ways, things like that, those things can be obviously fostered. But when you think of IQ specifically, as it is in a psychological sense to be measured and through tests, that is something that is sort of more endowment.
Yeah. Somebody recently was on the show and they basically were like, look, people don't like to hear it, but like intelligence is very much genetically driven and kind of inherited in all these things. Now you can do things to kind of move within some band around the starting point, which does mean that you have some control and you should do the right things, whatever. But unfortunately, that's just one of those things that you're not going to jump from 100 to 160, right?
Right.
And so the dark side of this conversation, I think, is like if you look at the numbers in the United States specifically, but probably globally as well, but I'm more familiar with the U.S. numbers, the decline of like the nuclear family is pretty well documented.
Yes.
Is it, although unfortunate, fair to say, hey, as we see that decline, there will be changes to cognitive development and childhood development in the families where there isn't two parents with the kind of loving, supportive, stable relationship that you're describing?
That's something I think about, a lot, having gone through parenthood myself and having to work at the same time, and just coming from, exposure to other countries and knowing what their sort of parental leave policies are, for example. And there's that saying that the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that will change the world or move the world. And, it feels like, at least in this country, that there's just nobody has time to rock who's in the cradle, who is growing up the babies, in the cradle right now. And like you said, the digital age with technology, there's kind of babysitting with the iPad and things like that. So I definitely think about that. And it just thinking about policies in place, even as one thing as parental leave and just having time, to adjust. In Canada, it could be up to a year or two of paid parental leave that you can get. But here, I think it's 6 weeks or something.
It feels like there's a spectrum of, like, we'll call it, again, just for lack of better descriptive word, like the traditional two-parent household, right, with one of the parents going to work and the other staying at home. Happens to be usually the wife was staying home and the husband was going to work, but could be in any form or fashion. That next step or evolution of that is both parents working, right? And maybe less time with the kids or whatever. But then there's this like very extreme version, which is, the again, I think unfortunate but quintessential example of like the single mother who's raising 3 kids and works 2 jobs. And unfortunately, politicians on both sides of the aisle like to point to that as like, that's who we're trying to help. But it feels like that environment is different and distinct from like, both parents work, right? There's still 2 parents in the household. And yes, maybe they're not spending as much time as kind of the traditional model, but it's a very different situation when it's, a single mother working 2 jobs and has 3 kids. How do you think about the development of the children in these different scenarios? And is it almost like a trajectory change in their cognitive development, or is there a different way to think about it?
I mean, you can think of examples, though, of people, right, who grew up with a single parent, right, who still go on to have academic success or music success. I'm thinking about, though, in the third example that you gave, and if it lends itself to more opportunities for children's issues, right, to go unnoticed, right, or you're less in the care of your parent, your caregiver, and so I know it takes a village, though, to raise children, right? There's the role of aunts and uncles and grandparents, of course, a lot of grandparents in these cases, and I think, if it does take a village, but we want to make sure that there's somebody at least that they're connected to, somebody that has an eye on, you just don't want them to be alone with unhelpful, for example, if they faced abuse or something like that, you don't want them to be alone with that. You want to have an eye and, be able to say, hey, what's going on? Hey, what's wrong? Notice changes. But when everybody's so busy working, things go unidentified, and then you have long-term poorer psychiatric outcomes.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating about the scenario, and if you kind of use hindsight as a crutch here, there are people who are successful based on a bunch of different aspects who come from the traditional 2 parents, one stays at home model to single mother or father with multiple kids and multiple jobs. And so I don't think that it necessarily prevents the outliers, right? In either one of those scenarios. I think the conversation that I see people having is more so like, what's the average, right? And if you go back to whether it's, a kid hears 30 million less words before kindergarten, or you look at certain family structures or kind of childhood experiences, it just makes it harder.
Yes.
And I think the people who end up being the outlier, they actually point back and like, that's why I'm successful.
Right.
It's because I experienced this early on and it drove me, it motivated me, it did whatever.
Yeah.
Is there a way for the parents in those situations? Can they do certain things to help with the cognitive development, even though maybe they don't have the kind of supportive, stable environment that you're saying is like, okay, that's option one, right? In kind of the ideal scenario. But are there certain things that either research or people have come across where it's like, if you're a single parent, here's some things that you can do. It may not be time. It may not be the ability to sit for 2 hours and talk to the kid, but there are certain things you can do that can at least have some impact.
Yeah, I think so. That question, it makes me think, you ensure that, they're going to school, they're taken care of, like medically. And then at a certain point, sometimes, like school, when they reach adolescent age, the peer group becomes a very big part of their world. And so if I'm getting it right, you're asking me if in the middle ground of these two situations, is there a way that parents can foster optimal cognitive development such that some of these people can also reach to the heights of, say, somebody who said that, well, it was this environment that made me who I am. I have grit, I have determination, I have the capacity to extract the good things from my environment and then enact those? Is that kind of?
If you think, so there's many stories where people have been successful coming from less than ideal scenarios. And what I've always found fascinating is usually the way they tell the story. And again, hindsight, you want to make it seem, like this heroic journey. But there's somebody, whether it was, hey, I had a single mother and they always told me that I would be successful, or they instilled a certain level of confidence, or they explained, hey, we don't have what everyone else has, but like we have the ability to work hard to eventually get that. Or there's always something that seems to come from that environment where they're able to latch on to it. And fortunately or unfortunately, there may not be one answer, right? It may just be, hey, you're dealt the cards that you're dealt and you have to help the kid develop as much as possible. But it sounds like what you're saying is it's not just the family, right? There's also school, there's also friend groups. Like there's other pieces that help to influence the development of the child as well.
Right. Yeah, it's actually it's why I went into the field of traumatic stress, because I was, growing up in Jamaica and seeing children sort of begging on the streets. But then you hear the heights of music fame, for example, with Bob Marley or the Usain Bolt, like sprinters and, great thinkers. And you're like, what is it in that environment that still, despite not having all the means, that still allows them to thrive? And I think that's why I went into the field to study, like, what are the resilient, is it spirituality? Is it like just a belief that, even though that, hardships are always going to be there, but I can still succeed if I just give my all, or is it, you plus your talent? I think that question is to be answered
How do you evaluate it today? Like, you've already been studying it for some time. I don't think you'll ever say like, okay, finally I figured it out, let me go to a different field.
Yeah.
But how do you evaluate what you've at least learned so far? This episode is brought to you by 8 Sleep. Good sleep is a game changer, and the 8 Sleep Pod is the best sleep machine. I sleep on it every single night. A great night of sleep allows you to be healthier, be more rested, and have more energy throughout the day. And on the brand new 8 Sleep Pod 3, you can sleep as cold as 55 degrees Fahrenheit or as hot as 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the secret of thermoregulation. Better sleep, better energy. Get yourself an 8 Sleep. You can go to 8sleep.com/pomp today to go ahead and get $150 off your order. 8sleep.com/pomp. Not only do I sleep on it every night, it literally changed my life, and I begged the founders to let me invest in the company. 8sleep.com/pomp. Go get yourself an 8 Sleep Pod and get a better night of sleep.
About resilience,
yeah.
Especially in childhood. I mean, again, I sound like a broken record here, but it is really that strong sort of parental buffering, helping you sort of make sense of unexplainable, for example, events that happen in our world. But firstly, I mean, as a parent, if you're a child, you do go through something catastrophic as a school shooting, right? The first thing as a parent should do is to listen. Don't assume that you know what they know, what is distressing to them, or what is even the most distressing thing about the school shooting to them. You want to be able to listen with an open ear and appreciate, their experience and their feelings, and not just rush to try to put a Band-Aid and solve it and say everything is going to be okay. You want to sort of validate and appreciate their experience and hear what it is that really impacts them, and you can ask that through like, what are your friends saying? Kind of open up the conversation, so that it's not as personal. Sometimes they don't want to feel like they're out of control. They're like, no, I'm fine. But you want to say, what are your friends saying? What are they talking about this? So kind of being a good listener, kind of getting to know what's on their mind. Also taking, your own temperature on the event, and getting support if you need it, whether that's from a spouse or your parents or a church person, kind of getting your sort of stability back, and so that you'll then be able to then listen and understand and help them make sense of what's going on.
So if we move from like the 0 to 5 to now kind of what I'll call school age, I'm sure that there's a much more scientific
school age is great.
description. So kind of elementary into middle school. Yeah. The things that immediately pop to mind are obviously there's, bullying that goes on and things that I would categorize as like they've been going on for a long time at that age. Yeah. What does the research there show in terms of things parents can do to help kind of their kids navigate it? And how much of it is just like, hey, you're going to deal with this and it's better just to listen versus be prescriptive in some way?
You're right. Bullying has gone on for a while, or roasting, or however you want to call it. And then it feels like the online way of it has just, can be 10 times, 100-fold worse. And the question, social media, thinking about a social media account for a school age child. I mean, obviously, 13 and under, because of the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act, they shouldn't have an account. They don't allow you to have an account. But thinking of, understanding, what are my child's friendships like right now, right? Is it filled with drama? Well, then imagine that online. It's going to be even worse. So, I guess I'm getting at the question, like, when can they have these digital tools to use responsibly? Are they able to commit to you? So I would imagine that family sort of technology plan to develop with, your teenager or your adolescent, on what are the expectations of the use? How long can you have it for? What are the consequences if you break the boundaries of this plan? What are the hours that you're able to use it from? Can they follow that contract with you, and will they be responsible enough to use that and have an account?
So with this family technology plan, is this like a parent sits down with their kids and it's like a negotiation?
Kind of like I mean, although you probably would want to have more of the structure of it, but you can make them feel to have some empowerment.
We call it a dictatorship masquerading as a democracy, right? that is definitely what that conversation seems to be like. But when you do that, you mentioned a couple of things. Mm-hmm. What are the types of things that are the most important there? Is it just like, hey, here's what you can do with these tools, whether it's social media, a cell phone or whatever, and here's what you can't? Is it more a focus on like the punishment? Like if you had to pick one or two key components of that technology plan for a family, what goes into that?
Definitely not the punishments. Okay. Even with punishment with kids, it doesn't teach them what they're supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to lay out more of here are the things that you can go on. But in terms of what you can't do, I would say just more in terms of like, I'm thinking of like location sharing and just things that would put their child in danger. But it's more of the expectations around use. You can use it maybe for 2 hours before dinner time, none during dinner time, what sites you agree that you can visit, things more so of what your expectations around the use are, and less on the punishment. But they do need to know what the consequences of it are in advance, so then you don't have to like in the moment be like, I think, well, you'll just, you're grounded forever, or you're going to take it away for 10 years, kind of thing. You want to have it just right that you can just say it and the consequence. We agreed to this.
Yeah. And that goes back a little bit to treating them like a human. Like an adult to some degree. How about their friends having access to certain things and them not, right? So when I think of elementary school and middle school, one of the like biggest areas of people being bullying, it's like what clothes they wear, who's cool, who's not type stuff. But also I remember being in high school and cell phones started to become popular, and my parents maybe would wait just 1 year, right? But like a lot of my friends got cell phones, I think like maybe freshmen in high school or something, and I had to wait till I was like a sophomore. And I remember this is the worst punishment in the world. It's like, look at that cool thing they have. Mm-hmm. High school is probably a little bit different than if you're in second or third grade or whatever it is. So like, how should parents think about not just like, hey, should my kid have this technology or not, but are there things to be considered of where maybe other parents are actually giving their kids technology, whether it's cell phones or social media accounts, and if your kid doesn't have it, does that open up any sort of issues or things to be aware of?
Yeah. Well, good for your parents. I know there is research to suggest that the longer you wait, it is better. Like they had a study, I think, between 9 and like 12-year-olds. 9 was too early. 12, the longer you wait a little bit, the better. But I hear what you're saying. It sounds like the concern is if all their friends have a phone and they're connecting over, texting or having a group chat, and from your personal experience, were you left out of some things, or did you?
I think it was more so the phones back then. You could play Snake, right? Like you could play Snake, and there was T9 texting, so you tried to do it as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, that's true. It was a smartphone.
But to the degree, it was like you definitely were like, hey, I want one of those, and you come up with all the nonsense excuses like, Mom, well, don't you want me to be able to call you after school to make sure I'm safe?
Right.
And she's like, no. Right. But I think that today, part of this is, the communication of kids. Obviously, you see, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, all these different things, TikTok, whatever. But also just texting. Like that is a way that kids communicate in kind of their everyday life. That yes, adults do it as well. But if we had text message groups at 9 years old. Like, I actually am glad I didn't grow up with that as an option, right? Yeah. Because I don't think that would have been probably a good thing in hindsight. But a kid obviously doesn't know that today, and they want to participate. So how do parents deal with that?
Yeah. No, it's, like you said, the social media, people have Instagram, TikTok, and it's all sort of ego-based. It's like your highlight reel of your life. And then you will, you'll be scrolling for ages, comparing yourself to people's highlight reel. And that can cause, obviously, anxiety, depression. Suicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescents 10 to 14 in this country.
Really?
Yes.
I did not know that.
The first one is accidents.
Accidents, and then suicides the second.
Suicides. And it's growing in the 9 and under population.
And what is driving that? Is it the social media? Is it?
That I'm not sure of. I'd have to do some more digging. But it is growing, and for adolescents is the second leading cause of death. Yeah. So really, you're asking good questions, right? Because you can really get into very serious waters here with our children. And, I think, just the online space, there's a lot to unpack. And I think if you can, have that first strong attachment with your child, be a good listener, have them develop that relationship with you to communicate, to tell, what's going on. You have a kind of pulse. Navigating then the technology years in adolescence will be a little bit easier.
How important is it to teach your kid that being different is good or like okay? Like to some degree, I just think of it as if you reinforce, do what everyone else does, follow what they're doing. In some ways, you're exasperating if you're different or if you're left out. Like it feels like it's more severe, like the feeling. Whereas if you've taught your kid from an early age, like being different is usually a good thing, right? If everyone goes right, sometimes going left actually can be valuable. Or if everyone is thinking one thing, actually thinking for yourself could be valuable. It feels like that just maybe dulls some of the problems where like, actually, if everyone else has a phone and I don't, what's the opportunity that I have versus feeling like I'm left out?
Yeah, it's almost sounding like you're doing what we call like a cognitive reframe about the situation, which is great, and like being different, there could be upsides to that, right? You're thinking differently, and it's about how you think about your situation and not get too one-sided or extreme. And so like even as a person myself of like mixed races, thinking about being different, yes, you feel a little bit like, okay, I cannot relate to everything that everybody, who maybe are more like homogenous. But then I have, I can draw from different cultural worlds, and that's okay too. There's a place for that as well.
Yeah. And another thing that comes to mind in kind of this like elementary into middle school, kids can start to read, right? Thankfully. But everything's so digital today. And I don't know if you've ever seen, there's like almost like comics or hey, 50, 100 years from now, the human evolution, like we're all just going to be these huge-eyed things from staring at screens all the time, right? And our necks will be slumped over. And, kind of the very dystopian view of the future human race. But today, is there a difference? Like if you have a kid who sits down and reads a physical book versus reads on a cell phone or on a laptop with the digital screen, like are there studies or research that shows like no, actually the physical book is better, or maybe the digital kind of consumption method is better? Or do we not yet have enough information to really know what the difference is?
That question, I don't know the exact science, but I can think about ways where technology could be helpful for kids who have trouble reading. They need those read aloud stories on the iPad, for example. That could be helpful. But then, obviously with the paper book, you have that tactile opportunity to touch the page, to turn the page, just a little bit more fine motor than maybe swiping on the iPad. So those are some differences, but I guess it also just depends for who. If you have special needs, maybe some help with the iPad and reading aloud programs would be beneficial.
Yeah. And along these lines of reading, I think most people in the business, finance, technology world, they're like, I want my kid to be smart, right? Which, cool. Everyone has pipe dreams. There's going to be a natural distribution of intelligence. But one thing that is definitely kind of intertwined in society is people who read are smart. And whether there's truth to that or not, most people I know want their kids to be intelligent. So they'd say, hey, you should read, you should read, you should read. Are there things around the reading, like if from a childhood psychological development, should a kid spend more time with other kids, or should they spend time reading? And like, if your kid is like the extreme and kind of like the quintessential nerd and just sits inside all day and reads, like, to me, like maybe that's not actually that great, because you actually do need this social interactions, but being 100% social and not reading at all. And so is this like a classic, just like everything in moderation probably is the best strategy?
Yeah, I think when parents want their kids to be smart, there's book smart, and then there are other aspects of life and functioning that outside the classroom, like if you're in a work environment, how good of a colleague or a team player can you be, right? So there's these social skills that they need to develop that they can, only develop with others, right? With their peers, taking turns, knowing boundaries, empathizing with the feelings of others. You'll get that from playing. And then, of course, when you have time to read and stretch your imagination, that there's a place for that too. And there's a place for even adult scaffolding to help children accomplish more than what they're able to do without adult assistance. There's a Russian researcher called Lev Vygotsky who talks about the zone of proximal development. So helping that, what it's basically that zone between what I just said, what a child can do without assistance versus what they can do with a more learned caregiver or teacher. So yeah, I think it's again having all these variety of opportunities to read, to play, to socialize, to bond with an adult. All these things
one of
come
the
together.
Pieces that it feels like in adolescence that can really help with the maturity of everyone is being exposed to many different ideas, many different cultures. And so you'll hear all the time people will say, kids who traveled a lot as a kid or as an adolescent, maybe even in the college years, they tend to have a more worldly view, right? And doesn't necessarily mean that they're more intelligent. It's just like they've been exposed to different things that others haven't. Is that a similar phenomenon when you're a kid? Like you just want to expose them to a lot of different things. Doesn't mean they're traveling, but you want them to read, you want them to play, you want them to do all these different things, and that kind of accelerates the cognitive development as well?
I wouldn't say it accelerates the cognitive development, but you just giving them opportunities to know that there's, with the traveling, that there's a different way of doing things than there's the way of the country that I come from, It just expands, like you said, their worldview, and that there's no, cultures around the world develop in, different norms and different values. And that makes them, just a more informed citizen. And so, yeah, just having your child, I think what you're talking about is maybe like a well-rounded sort of child when you give them these opportunities, right, to read or to play.
There's been a number of books that I've seen that are basically written about this idea of most people want their kid to be a specialist, right? So it's kind of one of the examples is like Tiger Woods. His dad was like, you're going to be a golfer at, 2 months old, like watch golf, swing golf club, be good at golf, right? And obviously went on and is greatest golfer of all time. But actually that is the outlier story compared to most people who end up being great at something, take more of a generalist approach and then focus later on in life. And so it sounds like from a childhood development standpoint, actually the generalization and general experiences may be a better path.
Yeah. And then looking at, but I mean, there are prodigies, there are things that you can observing your child to see if they're developing a talent, and then you want to support that. If they're great at art, or they have a musical inclination, just kind of seeing what they're good at and giving them the opportunity to learn that, master that, and take that with them.
What about the role of sports? And sports to me is always this like interesting thing where there's the parent who like, my kid's going to be in the NBA. You're like, probably not, but like, okay, good, nice dream, and maybe there's some bonding between the child and the parent. But it does feel like there's lessons learned from playing organized sports, whether it's hard work or teamwork or persistence, all these different things. Any thoughts about like, is there a certain age where that stuff is more important? Should, certain types of sports that end up being valuable?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you said, sports, you learn the teamwork. You have to have discipline. My sister was a swimmer. You'd have to get up in the morning before school for practice, and then after school again for another couple hours. Yes, there is ages that, it would be beneficial to have kids start to do an after school activity. Like 6 to 12, I'm thinking of that age, that stage, where they need to start having mastery over an activity or something that they can do, to feel like they've mastered something. It's they feel industrious, they've mastered like you said, a sport, and like you said, with sports, there's that team aspect, learning how to take losses, also, not to, I'm thinking of like when sports teams and they have this like big ego as well, that you can want to diminish that a little bit. Yes. So yeah, it's great. It all
feeds into it.
Yeah.
And then what about spending time with kids your age versus spending time with adults? Like there are kids that I know who, I don't know, they're probably in the 10 to 14 range. They're kids of friends of mine. And you talk to them and you're like, you are not a 10, like you just socially are able to communicate. You shake my hand, you look me in the eye. Like there's very specific things, the way that they have a command of the language, the things they talk about. You spend time with a lot of adults, it seems like, compared to another kid who, is running around. And again, these are extreme examples, but it feels like they spent way more time with kids than adults. Is there like a perfect formula, or is it just, again, general well-roundedness and you want them to spend time with adults, you want them to spend time with kids their age as well?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a perfect formula, but, I think they're both equally important. If you have, an older adult who can stretch their thinking, stretch their abstract thinking and things like that, that's very helpful, and then if you have your, if you don't, like you said, if you don't have a peer group and you sort of feel like left out, isolated, disconnected, that's going to burden you as well. And so you want to make sure that you also balance that with peers your age.
And in that, it feels like when kids hang out with each other, there's like many different settings that they can do it. So obviously school is a huge
big one.
There's things like sports or whatever. How important is it for them to hang out with each other outside of like the organized, school is very much, especially in today's day and age, like sit in the classroom, be quiet, we're going to teach you, and maybe there's recess or lunch or something. But almost like free form hanging out, like how important is that?
I think that's good too, to have some unstructured free time with your friends. Of course, also at that age, you're also doing after school activities. Like if you were involved in violin, you'd probably be continuing to do that. But you don't want to overschedule your kids, in so many activities that they just don't have time to be who they are with the friends. You want to have a balance. It's always a balance.
Yeah. If we go into the school, all kinds of crazy stuff happening. Seems like it's getting politicized. There's people from all different angles who think they know what's best for all kids. And so like the first thing I always caveat the conversation with is like all the kids aren't the same. And so there's probably different ways that certain kids develop or what would be quote unquote good for them. But maybe the first thing is just like when I think of traditional school today, I always think of it in a sense of like it's prison for kids. And what I mean by that, it sounds bombastic, but it's like we tell the kids to go somewhere, be quiet, sit down, and it's usually a very one-way kind of lecture. And again, as you get older, it becomes even more and more kind of the teacher is teaching you and you're there to sit and learn. But that's not really what the kids want to do. That's not how kids act. They've got tons of energy. They want to run around. And if there wasn't this like mandated school, they would probably not be doing any of that. They wouldn't be sitting down quiet anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so in some way, like school is very counter to what almost feels like their innate, desires. Does that help the kids? Does that hurt the kids? Again, is it just balance? And like maybe the ideal thing would be like they go to school for 3 days and they're out of school for 4 days, or like how do you think about that?
Yeah. I think that it always depends on the type of kid and what they need.
Okay.
So in the traditional schooling system you were mentioning, it's very structured. So for some kids, like a very unstructured day, someone, with ADHD, for example, it could be very overwhelming, for example. And maybe the traditional schooling model lends itself to the mastery of certain subjects a little bit better. But like you were saying, the shortcomings of a traditional school doesn't teach you sort of how to and this is, again, I don't want to be too extreme, but maybe it's less likely then to help you to, think for yourself and have that initiative, right, to take charge of what you're learning. And does it apply to me? And kind of ask those questions and develop the skills to become sort of a leader in that type of way. I don't think, like you said, that the traditional school is sort of like, you sit, you absorb type of knowledge. And I think in some ways, that structure, that routine is necessary in childhood because, children develop off of that. And then from there, then they develop as they're adults, right? We need that sort of routine, structure, predictability in our world. But I think at the end of the day, it boils down to what the kids need. If you have special needs, if you're a gifted child, for example, you might need a different environment.
Yeah. Well, one of the most popular kind of education models in the tech industry is the Montessori schools. Some of that's because there's people who've built very large companies and they went to Montessori schools. So everyone's like, well, if I want my kid to do that, then let's go put a Montessori school. Some of it is, no, actually, I think that's a better learning environment. So there's all different reasons people do it. What are the pros and cons of, kind of a more structured traditional system versus something that's more kind of the Montessori school? Like, hey, the hallmarks of that type of education is like they address the teacher sometimes with their first name, not the Mr. or Mrs. It may be more like, what do you want to work on today versus do this worksheet?
Yeah.
Like, is there research or anything in terms of there's different outcomes for kids who go through the different models?
I'm not aware of the different model research, but I think it just depends on the environment your child would thrive in. If they're like an independent sort of learner, thinker, self-starter, they do well with that, then the Montessori education could benefit them more. But say to your family, you want sort of a religious education, you want a traditional school, like the values, like obedience, authority, respect, those things a little bit are more important to you, then go with the traditional school. I think it's about finding the right fit. If you're not in the right environmental fit, that's when you can have problems.
Yeah. It's a fascinating way to think about like, it's kind of like company cultures.
Yeah.
There is no good or bad culture as much as you can go to a company and the culture is the culture.
Yeah.
And some employees are like, I love it here. And other employees are like, this is the worst place in the world.
That's right.
They usually quit, right?
Yeah.
And so it almost feels like it's similar to what you're saying. Actually, for the kid, they may enjoy one or the other, or the parents may align their values with one or the other. And then that's the better way to think about it.
Yeah. I think a fit is the best way to think about it.
When we talk about the schools, you mentioned ADHD earlier. The joke between me and all my friends is we all had ADHD. No one just knew to tell us it, right? As kids, we were rambunctious and we were constantly doing crazy things. And kind of my fear would be if I was a kid today, like they would have drugged the hell out of us and been like, oh, you guys all just need to sit here and basically not move. It's a joke, but like every great joke has a hint of truth in it.
Yeah.
And it does feel like there's been an explosion of awareness and diagnoses of ADHD. Obviously, things like Ritalin and others seem to have drastically increased in usage. Whether it should be or should not, how do you think about the childhood development of kids that now we're actually addressing something that maybe in the past was just looked at as, oh, they're creative or they're energetic or whatever. And teachers kind of just dealt with it, for lack of a better way. It seems like now there's like this pharmaceutical component that is pretty ingrained in school. Like, what have you seen there? Or how do you think about that? And is there a world where like actually some of the pharmaceutical stuff could be deemed as like external stress on the child because now you're changing the way that they normally would function?
Great questions. Very great questions and thoughts.
I told you, I got a lot. We'll sit here until I'm done.
Okay. I think, with ADHD, it is one of the most thrown out diagnosis there is, sometimes by people who shouldn't be sort of diagnosing someone with ADHD who, didn't do, for example, a proper assessment on them to figure out, because symptoms all can look the same, but what is the diagnosis that's driving these symptoms? You can have a cough, but, it doesn't tell me what diagnosis you have, if it's lung cancer or asthma or something, right? So kind of using just the symptoms alone and not doing a proper investigation, is this ADHD or is this really somebody who's traumatized? There are things that teachers can do in the classroom already to help kids with ADHD that don't hurt the other kids as well. Having a daily schedule on the board. You can put that kid a little bit closer to the front or something, giving them a little bit of extra time. There are accommodations that you can make in the school that don't hurt the other kids as well, that benefit them too. And you could also positive reinforcement at the end of the day, here's the number of stars I got for each of the things that I was supposed to accomplish for today. So, that's what I think. I'll stop here, and you can.
Well, it's fascinating. You mentioned sitting in the front of the classroom, and it's a dumb thing. When I was in college, I was playing football, and the coaches used to say everyone has to sit in the front row. I'm this is so dumb. It's not gonna why does it matter if I sit in the front or the back? In hindsight, it definitely mattered, right? And some of it may have been just the teacher can see if you're screwing around or whatever. But also for whatever reason, you're just closer to the information. Right?
Yes.
And you don't feel like you're hiding behind the rest of the class. There's an element of the class is behind you so they can see you if you're screwing around or whatever. And so I do wonder how much of the school environment, this idea that almost every classroom in America, for the most part, in the traditional school system, is built the same way. There's a chalkboard or a board, right? There's rows of seats, and how much of your academic progress and success is literally determined by whether you chose to sit in the front or the last row?
Oh, geez, that I don't know. I don't know that
Well, we might not have a quantitative answer, but it does feel there's something.
I would imagine that a child who chooses to sit in the front seat might be just more motivated and engaged and want to be closer to the teacher and absorb as much as they can. So then it would kind of self-select sort of the students that end up doing better because they choose to sit in the front. And then whereas the back, the teacher doesn't have as much control, and oversight over those at the back. It
also brings up this idea. We recently were talking about this idea of founder volatility. So people who start companies, if you almost think of volatility. So if you have very little volatility, it's basically your behaviors and your outcomes are within kind of a very narrow band.
Okay.
That's great if you want to start, let's say, a small business. So you want to start a restaurant, or you want to start some local business, which traditionally the goal is just to make money, right? And you want to have profit and kind of grow the business in a somewhat linear way. In the technology industry, you actually want exponential growth.
Okay.
And so the idea here is that there's a lot of outliers, or you want the outliers.
Okay.
So in order to get outliers, you need volatility.
Okay.
And so actually what happens is that the greater the volatility, the greater the potential outcome. Okay. But you can't take someone with very little volatility and get an outlier outcome for the most part, right? And so what that leads me to believe or think about is when I was in high school and middle school, there's always the teacher who would be I don't know what the outcome is going to be here, but you're either going to be super successful or you're going to get in a lot of trouble. But you always knew who those kids were. And they used to be the class clowns, the people who caused problems, who screwed around in the hallways or whatever. But if you extrapolate it out, there was a lot of volatility in those people. Some of them ended up not doing anything.
Right.
And some of them ended up being highly successful.
Right.
And so it almost feels like the school clamps down to some degree on the people who tend to have that volatility because they want everyone to be quiet, sit in the seat, not be disruptive to the school.
Right.
Should maybe we be encouraging more of that and saying to ourselves, no, that's actually where some of our best business people or scientists or whoever may come out of that bucket of kids rather than the other?
Today's episode is brought to you by FTX US. They're a safe, regulated way to buy Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies.
They've got very cheap fees, sometimes as much as 85% cheaper than their competitors. There's also no minimum fees, there's no withdrawal fees, or any other hidden fees. Ultimately, FTX US is trying to make it dead simple for you to buy Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. They also now have digital stock trading as well, with no transaction fees and no payment for order flow. All you have to do is go download the FTX app today from the App Store and use code POMP, and you'll get some money back every single time you trade $10 or more. Again, go download the FTX app today, use code POMP, and every time you trade $10 or more, they'll go ahead and they'll give you some crypto back. The more you trade, the more you earn. Download the FTX app today.
No, yeah, I think that's a great example and a great question, because as you said, if you were to say, like, if I were to do a comprehensive assessment on you as a child and all your friends, and everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Everybody, so when it comes to like measuring cognitive intelligence, for example, that's a combination score basically of your verbal capacities, your verbal reasoning, verbal concepts. That's one. Then we have processing speed, how fast or slow you process information. We have visual spatial skills like puzzles, right? We have things like fluid reasoning, how good at you are at taking some novel concepts and just kind of making order out of just new information, abstract information. And so each of you or your profile, each of your friends have different strengths and weaknesses, and it's about harnessing that and finding out sort of, like what careers and fields that will be good for, what the way you learn best. Are you a sequential processor, or are you able to take in information simultaneously and then just kind of make something novel out of that? So understanding how these kids learn, understanding then how also their behavior sort of shapes, if you're learning chunks is better. Those are things that a good psychological assessment could help you understand and figure out what fit then of a school should benefit you, benefit you.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. And we've been talking about school from a traditional sense of kids go, there's teachers, the whole 9 years. Over the last 2.5 years, there's been some big changes in schools. So obviously there was the school shutdowns where kids couldn't go to school. They were doing Zoom or whatever. I've seen screenshots on the internet where like kids were literally on their laptops in their bed while the teacher's teaching or whatever, right?
Or not in school, not logging in and missing a whole year of school.
And so like, I guess just like, let's start there with just the school shutdowns, which largely seem to be over now, but there are 6 months to some schools 18 months where kids were not physically going to the school. Like what are we seeing now, or how are you thinking about that from a development standpoint?
Yeah, as we said before, we're beating a dead horse, but the school is a place where, it provides a routine. You wake up in the morning, eat your breakfast, and then you go to school. Schools have that sense, give students or children that sense of routine, predictability, and stability. It also is a place where students would get some of their extra social services if needed, right? Or free lunches sometimes, if you qualified for that. It was the place where you could teachers could identify, for example, if there's abuse going on in the home. So when you have all these shutdowns and you have students not doing that, less face-to-face time with their peers, not like walking to class, more sedentary lifestyle, now, we're seeing, this youth mental health crisis that we talked about. And it's been devastating. I'm glad that schools have reopened. And then there was a portion when it did reopen, but then when there was an exposure in the class and you had to shut that, or the people who are exposed for like 14 days, stay home. It's just so much instability and unpredictability. So 15 days you're at home, then back into school again. And then for the poor parents who, had to work. And if you had kids under 5 during the pandemic, having to work and take care of you, it was just a special place in hell for that.
Yes, it's if you ever talk to like your grandparents or were fortunate to talk to your great grandparents and like the quintessential like back during the war, right? I feel like 20, 30, 40 years from now, people will be like back during the pandemic, and the kids will be like, shut up.
Yeah.
but it was very traumatic for parents.
Yeah, it was. I was pregnant in the pandemic. I had the baby in the pandemic and worked and had another one.
And it's just a whole different experience, right?
Yeah, different experience.
The other piece of this is when kids went back into the classroom, and still to this day, many schools still require kids to wear masks in the school. And so at first I was like, well, whatever the local ordinances are or whatever, like, okay, schools are just going to repeat that. But then I started to read about some of this and they were like, no, like a huge piece of learning to communicate with folks is like the facial expressions and seeing someone's mouth as they talk and like all these things. If you're a kid and you're 7 years old and 2 years of the 7 years you've been alive, you haven't seen people's mouths, like there could be development problems there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, I don't think we have all the information to kind of really understand this.
Yeah.
But how big of a problem or how like alarmed should parents be that, hey, your kid went to school for, years at this point, literally with something over their face, and so did all their classmates and their teachers. And like, is that something to worry about?
Yeah, I know. As you say, we don't have all the answers. I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't really talk about like the breathing or the respiratory effects of wearing a mask for 2 years for kids 2 and above. But, it does, on the outset, it feels like, you're not seeing the formation of the mouth, the movement, if you're learning to speak. And I know there has been some increase in speech and language services since the pandemic. They haven't directly related it yet to the masks. And I know there's also research to show that schools that did require some of the mask mandates were able to stay open a bit longer. Mm-hmm. And again, as a parent, and with a young child of 2, having him not see his teacher's mouth and I guess you can you can see the eyes and you can see smiles, but it's not the same. And we don't know. We just don't know. We have to better understand that as our field faces this new sort of issue.
Yeah. And to me, we can't go back and change the past, right? It is what it is. It happened. Whether you agree with it or not, that's where we are. I think the bigger question is if this now becomes a crutch from a response standpoint to future issues, right? We've seen there is monkeypox, right? That's gone, and all of a sudden you see some states being like, "Oh, state of emergency," and it just feels like once you've kind of breached it, it's just like let's go back to that thing because this is the playbook. Like something happens, we go state of emergency, we do this. Right. And if the part of the response is, hey, everyone in school put on masks, and then it's just like every year kids are putting on masks, now all of a sudden like the long-term impact of this could be very, very important to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you were highlighting sort of a very reactionary response, a response sort of based out of fear. Mm-hmm. And we know when we respond to something, when we're overwhelmed or based out of fear, our thinking gets very narrowed and we're not able to think flexibly and have a response that really requires what, you can't assess the problem as good as you can if you're reacting out of fear. Mm-hmm. And so I think, it's a time for leaders to come together and think about what are the concerns here? And if this continues in a long term, what should, the response be? Thinking, more so about children's development long-term going through this. Yeah. Absolutely.
As we think about that development, I know that you've done some work on like children's exposure to violence in the United States. And violence can encompass a lot of things. There's obviously domestic violence. There's, hey, I was at a place where I saw violence occur, in my community. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's violence at school. There's school shootings, things like that. Yeah. Help me understand a little bit better in terms of like some of the research that you've done there and like what are we learning about children's exposure to violence in the U.S. In light of their kind of cognitive development? Oh, wow. Yeah, they're,
I think 2/3 of children witness violence in the U.S.
2/3.
Yeah, growing up. And worldwide, 70% of people experience something traumatic. Fortunately, only about 15 to 20% go on to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So I've done some work in the trauma field, child and family traumatic stress. And like you said, a traumatic event could be something where, you witness the loss of life of someone, or it could be a domestic violence incident or school shootings, suicide. And so trauma it's this external sort of injury, it's a Greek word for injury, trauma. And it sort of leaves the person unable to cope, overwhelmed, helplessness, horror. But and then there are certain signs and symptoms. Would it be helpful to share some of them?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So with the traumatic experience, some of the symptoms that we see is a lot of hyperarousal. So exaggerated startle. If you hear like a noise, you immediately kind of like you're hyperaroused, you startle easily. We have some of the re-experiencing symptoms like the nightmares and the flashbacks and the intrusive thoughts and memories. And then you have the negative alterations in cognition and mood. So you'll hear things like the world is a bad place, all people are scary, I can't trust other people, I can't trust police. And then you have obviously some changes in mood. So depression, isolation, unable to feel positive feelings. And then you have one of the hallmarks of trauma is this avoidance piece. So not wanting to see or remember or hear things related to the traumatic incident, not wanting to go by, if the school, for example, there's big avoidance cognitively and in person, like not wanting to physically see. So you have those symptoms that constitute sort of the clinical symptoms of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, not everybody who goes through a traumatic event will end up with PTSD. But the earlier you can identify these signs and symptoms, the better, and match them with evidence-based treatments that work, the better we can put kids back on the path to recovery and normal developmental trajectory.
What are some of the evidence-based treatments that kids can go through that, I don't know if it reverses or maybe just kind of dulls the effects of?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So for say a kid was exposed, so there's different phases of the trauma exposure. So there's the acute phase, like that's the on-scene sort of response when you see police show up. And then there is a phase in between that event up to 30 days. We call that peritraumatic phase. And then you have the longer term phase a month and after. And so, having trained at the Yale Child Study Center at the Yale Center for Traumatic Stress and Recovery, they developed a treatment for that peritraumatic phase, for example. So right after an event and then the days and the weeks leading afterwards, that actually children who go through that are 65% less likely to meet criteria for PTSD. So it's preventing the onset of PTSD. So that treatment is called the Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention, also known as CFTSI. But say it's been a longer time, like 6 months and out years. The other intervention for that, the evidence-based treatment that children can get is called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT. Those two are great evidence-based treatments for these specific periods after the traumatic event.
30 days right after, like what is going on in that program or that intervention?
Yeah. So, if you think about the traumatic dysregulation, right, those symptoms that I hadn't explained, kind of repeating the experience of sense of loss of control. So it's not only the experience of the traumatic event, right? That's traumatic, but it's your then symptoms. You're feeling personally out of control, your body, your mind, the way you think, the feelings. That intervention is for children ages 7 to 18. The aim is to help have a caregiver, a supportive caregiver, or a parent it's a family strengthening approach. It's basically to help turn the volume down on some of those symptoms, identify those symptoms, actually, which ones are the most distressing, turn the volume down on it, and help the caregiver and the child communicate better about the experience. So you don't go through actually the details of the event. You don't have to relive and talk about and debrief what happened, but really it's how to help them sort of turn the volume down on those most distressing symptoms.
And how much of this is only addressable after the fact? So, let's go to the extreme and say a school shooting, for example, versus in the military where PTSD is quite prevalent. They tend to do, whether intentionally or not, a ton of what I'll call mental conditioning. That's a very unscientific term during basic training and all these things. Like they put people in hard situations. They seem to attempt to increase the mental toughness and all this stuff. Now, a school shooting is not a sense of like, hey, my kid should have went and played sports and like developed mental toughness, right? That there's a super traumatic event that seems to be an outlier, which is more akin, frankly, to combat or something like that. But then there's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't seem as extreme, but still is traumatic or provides stress. And so is there an ability for parents to hope for the best, right? And say, hey, I hope my kid never deals with any sort of traumatic event or anything, but they can do things to increase, whether it's like the mental toughness or do things to help them be prepared in case they ever do encounter one of these situations? Or is really the only thing that we know so far that works is like evidence-based treatments after the fact, and that's where we can have some impact?
Okay, so you're asking if there's anything to do to prepare the child's functioning in the event of such a traumatic.
So, like in the most layman's way to think about it, right? There are parents who are like, I'm going to make my kid do hard shit because like the world is hard out there, right? And like learning that lesson today in this like somewhat controlled environment is much better than like, let me coddle them and then send them off into the world and like they get punched in the face, metaphorically by like the world. Do we know, like, if people are put into those situations before a traumatic event, do they tend to have more resilience and less of the PTSD kind of impact afterwards? Or is it really just this like kind of 30 or 6 month?
Yeah, no, it's definitely not the 30 days after thing that sets apart, that can help someone recover from PTSD. We look at previous functioning, right, prior to an event happening, and their sort of developmental a snapshot of their developmental sort of status. Like, we want to know kind of what their life was like prior to this event, so we can know kind of, what was their normative functioning, and how is it then disturbed or distressed after the traumatic event. So, if your child was, you had a stable school life, you had a caregiver who you could rely upon, they were engaged in extracurricular activities, that they felt masterful, that they were doing well in school already academically, all these things. And then after the event, if you have then a supportive caregiver to help the child, most times they'll be all right. So it's not about what you can really do to prepare. I think what you're touching upon, though, is that when a traumatic event happen, their world is sort of shaken and their thinking gets a little bit shaken as well, right? Their thinking kind of, then they start to over accommodate their thinking to like, oh my gosh, like the world is unsafe and very scary. And so it's kind of helping them get back to a more realistic and helpful statement. If their world is safe, you want to remind them that the world is safe.
It's this weird conversation in society today, because I think that it gets politicized. But if you kind of strip away all the emotional components and the politicalization of it, to some degree, there is this undertone where a large portion of society feels like, oh, kids today are coddled, and whether it's in the school system or by their parents or whatever, and there's like less mental toughness, right? Now, I say that from the sense of, I grew up in a family with 5 boys, and like, a lot of disagreements got settled with our fists, right? And so like naturally that's a very different environment. But if you just kind of revert to the mean, right? It's like, you don't want a society where everyone is coddled and like basically somebody says, mean words to you and your whole life gets derailed. But you also don't want, I don't know, like ancient Rome warriors where everyone's like walking around ready to like kill each other, right? So like there's some middle ground that I think as a society we're like, cool, we want people to have some degree of resilience and kind of this mental toughness, but also we want to be very cognizant of the fact that like, the kid who is sitting in a classroom, all of a sudden gunshots go off and somebody comes to the school and starts shooting, like they are going to have to deal with shit, right? And not only the kids, like the parents probably as well. And so when we think about this, it feels, again, it gets politicized. And so it gets over-rotated on both sides. But, a common theme of our conversation today just feels like, it's like the moderation. It's like, no, listen, you can in some ways be, I heard the phrase recently, demanding but supportive. And so you want to have the demanding aspect of the like, hey, there is a real world and you want to be prepared for it, but also don't forget the supportive part. Yeah,
it's like an authoritative parent. You have the authoritarian who's a very demanding, but the authoritative, is one who you do have expectations, but they're also very warm at the same time. So you're kind of giving that both balance.
Authoritative parent.
Yes, versus authoritarian.
Interesting. Explain this more about an authoritative parent.
Yeah, you're just very warm. You're loving. You have an attachment with your child, but you also have expectations as well, and you're firm and consistent in the rules of the family and the consequences. You're not overly permissive, which is the opposite of authoritarian. You're just kind of laissez-faire. You can do whatever you want, kind of. If you want a car, I'll buy you one kind of thing. So the authoritative is the balanced one that's we found is linked to better outcomes for kids.
Yeah, so it has this element of like there's an expectation and to some degree discipline or something is kind of laced into that, but also you're still the parent and you still care about the kid.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
It's very similar to management. Right?
I'm sure there's a term in management, right?
Yes.
What is the term?
Yes, I guess if you're a good boss, then you make a good parent, hopefully. Identity is another thing that you've spent a lot of time looking at. You have a very unique background in that you are Jamaican and Chinese descent. How does identity play into a child's kind of cognitive development? And like, is that something that the parent kind of dictates to the kid, like you are X, and then they internalize it?
It's a great question.
Or is it something that they just like
so great question.
implicitly get?
Yeah, there's so many ways to go with this. Okay. Well, to answer the latter question about does parents play a role into a kid's identity, I'm thinking about James Marcia's theory on identity development, which which uses two sort of constructs on exploration and commitment. And when you cross the two, you get 4 outcomes. So I'm thinking of, you said there, like if a parent said like, hey, like we're, Italian or something, this is the cultural identity you need to adhere to. And so you as a kid, then they just like accept that. You would be called in that Marcia's 4 outcomes, you would be what's called in the foreclosed identity. So you didn't do any extra exploration. You're already committed to this Italian identity. And then if you did like high exploration, so you were high, you looked around a little bit we've talked about careers, for example, right? You looked around and then you committed to this highly, you would be what's called the achieved sort of integrated identity. However, there's another identity status that could be very diffuse, like you haven't committed to anything and you haven't done any exploration. You kind of aimlessly there in society. You don't really have meaningful friendships. You're easily swayed by different things. You don't really have a sense of self. And then the fourth and final one is identity moratorium, which is you haven't committed yet to anything, but you're still searching. You're searching a lot. So there's 4 types of sort of identity statuses on somebody's identity development journey based on exploration and commitment. And then forgetting the first part of your question.
So like just take that as an example.
Okay.
There's 4 of these identity buckets. Is any of them better than the others? Like is there like a design, like, hey, we want kids to end up in bucket 4 or?
Yeah, bucket 4, the one about high exploration and high commitment, you kind of feel like this integrated sense. Okay, I did some, research. I looked around. I didn't just kind of take my parents' word for it type of thing.
Kind of earned it?
Like I earned it. I explored things and I feel comfortable with this final resolution kind of thing. It would probably feel more comfortable. My decision. And it's an informed decision. Like I made an informed decision. I didn't just like sort of take what was like given to me. And then, of course, some can be more anxiety provoking than others. So like if you're in a state of moratorium and you're searching around, you can probably feel some level of anxiety, like looking for who you are. So then I guess if you then move into the achieved identity, you feel a little bit more just some more relief.
Yeah. What's fascinating about this is I can think of 2 different aspects of like identity, right? So like let's take religion and maybe ethnicity.
Yeah.
And to me, my family's Italian, right? So big Italian family, like there's every single thing that is a generalization pretty much like check the box. Right? Well, it's just, and by the way, every other large Italian family for the most part, like, yeah, they eat a lot of pasta, they get pretty loud, right? Like all these things. But what's fascinating about it is you're told as a kid, like, we're Italian, but it's not like, hey, when we get in a disagreement, everyone raise their voices, right? Or that is almost like a learned behavior to some degree. And every single other person I knew that was Italian, I would go to their house and it was the same thing. Like it wasn't a thing where I was like, oh, that's weird. Like it was like, yeah, of course, this is how families operate. And you only notice it once, then you would go to a friend's house who's not Italian. You're like, everyone's so quiet around here. So like, to me, that's like almost like you're in an environment, you pick up certain things. And, I have experience with an Italian family, but if you went to an Irish family or you went to, a Chinese family or whatever, like there's certain things culturally that are unique to that culture they pick up. Religion feels much more like you are told things where I have friends who are Muslims, Jews, Christians, the whole gamut. None of their parents were ever like, you should go out in the world and explore all these other religions, right? Like that was not a thing. It was like, we are X, you will follow X rules, like whatever the religion was. And it feels much more kind of authoritative, like top down. Yeah. I'm going to take you on Sunday to church, right? Or I'm going to take you to the synagogue or whatever. Like Is there different parts of an identity that have these different interactions, or is that just like us trying to make sense of the world that maybe we grew up in or experienced?
When you say interactions, what do you mean?
Well, one's like explicit, like we are X religion and
Gotcha.
and as X religion we do A, B, and C.
Yes.
The other is more implicit because no one sits you down and is like, we do A, B, and C. It's just you kind of like learn the behavior a little bit.
Right.
As a child, does it matter which one, or is it actually better to get both types of learning?
Okay, well, I'm thinking of with religion, for example, like you're right, like our parents, I mean, my parents didn't give me any choice either, being Catholic. But
they're like, you know what, the Jewish people, you should go hang out with them, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a decision that I think that as parents, they have that authority to make. Now, when you get older, at least they've given you that experience and education that you can choose then, okay, do I want to still continue this because you are an adult? But I think if you didn't have that, because I'm thinking from just some of the psychological benefits that people who are religious and spiritual can get out of kind of learning about duty, caring for the vulnerable. And I have this thing with psychology. I feel like it's divorced its self. If you think of the word psychology, it's the study of the soul, the spirit. And in an effort to, I think, be more like hard science, physics, scientifics, it's really tried to separate itself from some things that are a little bit more like theistic. But when you're looking at who we're studying, like the human experience and the fact that many people in the world are religious, or belong to a practicing religion, we are missing a big part of the picture with that.
All right, I have one big last topic to talk about. This is a huge open secret, which is whenever I sit down with other couples, my wife and I, and we are at dinner or at lunch or we're hanging out with them, whatever, the number one topic that everyone always talks about, but no one wants to admit publicly, is they are all deathly afraid of raising kids that are spoiled. And this is everything from friends who they are teachers to super wealthy to immigrants to people who are born in America. I mean, just like across the board. It seems like it is a deep-seated fear of parents where they say to themselves, my child is going to have a different childhood than I had. That's almost every parent's dream, right? Is I want my kid to live a better life than I had, or I want my kid to be happier than I had, or have things that I didn't have, whatever. And there are the extreme examples, right? I'll use a celebrity in Jay-Z, right? And I think he's openly talked about it. He has kids now, and he's like, my kids are living a little bit differently than I did. And that's a good thing. He accomplished that as a parent. But then also that same story is very true, right? I have a lot of friends who are immigrants and they're like, look, like I was literally born in another country and I came here. My kid already just being born in the United States, I feel like they have a leg up and they're going to have this different experience. What can parents do to increase the probability, not guarantee, but increase the probability that their kids don't end up spoiled if they just are having a different childhood? Like what do you see there from a development standpoint and an environment standpoint?
That's a great question. And I think the way to answer it is to sort of understand what you think your friends mean by spoiled. What do you think they mean by like, I don't want to spoil my kid when they say spoil?
Every single one of them is different, obviously. But if I had to, in the most crude way, outline what they mean, they don't want their kid to be fucked up. Right? Like, and I think what the fear, again, people just naturally go to the extreme, is you see an actor or an actress's kid, they're, this young kid, and they become a teenager, and next thing you know, you read about them in like TMZ because they're addicted to drugs, or, like the very, very extreme. I don't think that's necessarily they're like, oh my God, I'm so worried that my kid's going to grow up like in the spotlight, because many people aren't public figures or anything. They're more so worried about like, will my kid work hard? Will my kid actually understand the importance of learning? Will they, be ambitious? Like all these things that I think society generally puts value on. How do they make sure that their kid gets those instead doesn't just become kind of a, shithead kid who's like, oh, my parents will take care of me.
Yeah. So it sounds like, being spoiled. And it's true. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the parents that give their kids anything that they ask for at any time. They don't expect much of them. It's the low sort of expectations to give back to their family or to give back to society. So, I think to prevent that spoiledness is to make sure that they have, those opportunities to contribute to the society, to their family, because otherwise when you just give them things and you have no expectation of them to do anything to give back, I think you can then quickly get to that route that you painted.
So it's almost like setting the expectation setting may be the single most important thing of making sure that the kid understands what those are, and also almost holding them accountable to some degree to try to meet the expectations.
Yeah, holding them accountable, getting them involved in volunteering or just what they do for chores at home. Sometimes kids grow up with no chores because you resented doing that as a kid. It's important not to do anything like reactively, like to be conscious and think about your parenting sort of strategy and your expectations for your kids, not as just as a reaction to what I don't want to do as I had experienced growing up.
I think every parent would be the world's best parent if their kid didn't have to make their bed, right? like that is the bane of many kids' existence. Like, I got to make my bed. And then I guess as a part of that, like, my dad used to say this all to me. He wouldn't say it directly to me, but he would say it in front of me to people. He would always say, my kids don't need another friend. They need a parent. And it sounds very similar to what you're saying in terms of there's expectations. This like authoritative parent, this like almost demanding but supportive
exactly
type thing fits very similar and kind of weaves itself together, where the parent should be the parent. And if you do that with any degree of success, like your kid should be okay. Yeah, should be okay. I mean, like you said, it's that balance of having expectations, you being in control at a certain, for certain things. But you're also a warm, supportive listener. You're there for them to hear things out if something's going awry. You're just not, and it's just not being that extreme sort of helicopter. I'm going to control everything you do, because, you have to ask yourself what is driving that anxiety and fear? Is it because, you don't want anything bad to happen to them? Well, you have to prepare them that bad things will happen, right? Bad things can happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. Bad people do good things. Bad people do bad things. There's just, as long as they're not like having sort of like you're trying to control their whole world, and, sort of shelter them from every sort of possible thing that could imagine, they're not going to learn the skills to manage it when it does happen, and the world is going to be shattered. Yeah. It feels scary, I think, to parents to kind of put their kid out in the world for at the same time it's going to happen.
Yes.
Can't slow down time.
Yes.
All right. My last question for you is, you are a trained child psychologist or a clinical psychologist. You have 2 kids. What do you do with your kids that may surprise people, or something that that you do with your kids that you feel is really important, that if you could tell all of your friends who had kids, like, hey, this is the thing I feel like is so important?
Okay, great question. And I will, a lot of the questions we talked about today was how to set our kids up for success, how to ensure optimal cognitive development across domains, and how to set that up with their activities or with their friends. How do we provide enough to set them in to provide enough to pay for like the best education that they can have, and as a working parent too. And as well, thinking about all those questions that you asked me, having worries and concerns about those things. What I really think parents, what I do with my kids, or what also helps me, is to really play with them. Let's sit on the carpet and play with them, and just be with them. Be with them, play with them. There's all that good oxytocin is flowing through everybody, that bonding. And, it takes you away from the worries of, making money or being the best, researcher you can be. And, they're also getting a lot of learning opportunities from you as that again, attentive, nurturing, supportive caregivers, just to play. Play. Peekaboo, hide and seek, sing, be silly, have a balloon fight, pillow fight, jump on the couch for a little bit, play with them.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's no matter how much we analyze all of this, it always goes back to the simplest thing.
The basics, right?
Like literally just love your kid and hang out with them.
But not be their friend.
Exactly. Where can we send people to find you on the internet or find some of your research if somebody wants to follow up based on some of the stuff we talked about today?
I think the only social media platform I have is Twitter. I came off of Instagram and Facebook, so I'm at Dr. Misiaszek, and I have a practice website, khmpsychology.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I know that a lot of people are really looking forward to this, and we'll definitely have to have you back in the future.
Thank you. It was great being here, Anthony. Thanks for having me.